So I would like to invite now Professor Eugene Rogan and Professor Christian Sahner. Christian, I'm handing it over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Judith. And thank you for a great presentation that just happened. I think Eugene Rogan requires no introduction with an audience made up of people from the Faculty of Oriental Studies, but just to point out our basic geographic coordinates. Eugene arrived in Oxford in 1991. He is professor of modern Middle Eastern history and director of the Middle East Center at St. Anthony's College. And Eugene is a prolific author. Just to name a few of his books, his first, Frontiers of the State in the Late Ottoman Empire, was focused on Transjordan. That's 1999. In 2009, his grand synthesis of the history of the Arabs since 1517. And then most recently in 2015, Fall of the Ottomans, the Great War in the Middle East. So the history of World War I in the Arab lands. But today we're going to talk about a bit of an old project, new project. This is a subject that Eugene has worked on in the past. I understand he's put it aside for quite some time and is now back at it with the hopes of, I think, producing a book in the coming years. And this is the famous sectarian moment of the modern Middle East, the violence that engulfed Mount Lebanon and Damascus in the year 1860. So I will say nothing more other than to welcome Eugene and maybe to kick this off by inviting him to give us a rough outline of these events and why they're important.
Well, Christian, thank you for that warm introduction. I think the only thing you left off, if I can refer to myself in the third person, is that Eugene is an utter space shot. And Alison, I feel completely cheated. I had it in my head we were starting at 2. Thank you, Christian, for the call to remind me to get my presence onto this meeting ASAP. But Alison, I'd love to sit down and hear all the marvels that I just missed out on. So forgive me for the late joining. But thrilled to bits to have the opportunity to talk to colleagues about, as Christian's pointed out, something of an old new project. A project which actually I've received faculty support for doing research in Ottoman archives in Istanbul way back at the beginning of the century, and which I'm glad to be taking off as my sabbatical writing project when I head off on sabbatical next academic year. If you like, Christian's already hinted that 1860 is kind of a turning point moment in the modern history of the Middle East. As some of you will know, it's the point that al-Bahrani decided to start his Modern History of the Middle East paper, which we teach still for the MPhil in Middle Eastern Studies. What is it about 1860 that represents this kind of rupture and a starting point for our discussion of the modern history of the Middle East? On the one hand, it's a moment of tremendous violence. It's a year which was marked by sectarian killing in Mount Lebanon first, and then in the course of the summer of 1860 spreads into Damascus when a Muslim mob runs through the largely Christian quarters of Bab Sharki and Bab Tuma and kills an estimated 4,500 to 6,500 people in 3 days of bloodletting in July of 1860. In itself, that doesn't seem like necessarily the starting gun for modernity that we all have in mind. But I think that the background to the events is very much linked to an intersection between ideas that came from Europe, trade coming from Europe, technologies coming from Europe, and a moment in which the Ottoman Empire, after a kind of wholesale openness or adoption, begins to meet the kinds of local resistance that makes the Ottoman state rethink how it wishes to interpret the new modes of modern life, and where we see the reform process in the Ottoman Empire very much mediated through Istanbul, rather than being left as a sort of laissez-faire intervention by outside powers. To put it in more concrete terms, I think if we were to say, why did you have a massacre in 1860 in Damascus? It had a lot to do with the changing economic realities of the first half of the 19th century, in which the opening of the Eastern Mediterranean through trade to the industrial products of Western Europe was creating all sorts of economic crises in commercial and artisanal sectors that were really affecting producers among Ottoman Eastern Mediterranean cities like Damascus, Beirut, Aleppo. What's distinctive about Damascus, it's not a port city, so it didn't get the kind of fringe benefits of the rapid growth that came to places like Alexandria, Beirut, and Izmir. Rather, Damascus saw its position being threatened by these economic changes. And then the other big change that's coming from above, as it were, within the Ottoman context, is the changing legal standing of the minority communities in the Ottoman Empire. Here, being promoted by an Ottoman state, trying to prevent the European powers from using minority rights issues as a reason to intervene in Ottoman affairs. And it's when you begin to get laws or edicts passed by the Ottoman central government, starting in 1839, reinforced in 1856, that establishes legal equality for the first time between Muslims and non-Muslims. And I think the economic changes plus these legal changes begin to create a kind of empowered minority community who in their own behavior begin to fracture the social order under which they had lived in peace with their Muslim majority neighbors, and is creating a context within which tremendous violence will erupt. And I think it's in addressing the roots of that violence and then rebuilding Ottoman Damascene society in a way that preempts a European intervention and restores cohesion, that we can see a distinctly Ottoman modernity emerge that's going to be really influential in the region. So, I mean, as far as the starting points go, Christian, I think that's where I would frame what's brought me to this subject and where I see the material taking us.
Great. I mean, any student of the modern Middle East knows the events of 1860, and there is no shortage of previous writing on it. And so, if I may, the next question is, what is new here? What sorts of new sources have you dug up? What are the new perspectives that you're going to bring to bear on this episode that has been well researched and studied in the past?
Yeah, very fair point. And one thinks of, again, Albert Hourani, Kamal Salibi, Layla Fawaz. There's been quite a large and growing literature of people focusing on the events of 1860 in both Mount Lebanon and in Damascus. What really got me started on this research was a chance discovery in the American archives. I was working to advance my doctoral research in the 1980s in the American archives in Washington, D.C., consulting the papers from consulates in both Damascus and Jerusalem, and noted that the first volume of consular papers for Damascus dated to 1859, when a first vice consul to represent the USA, at that point, a very small country on the verge of civil war, not really a power in the Mediterranean yet. The Americans could really only work in the Eastern Mediterranean by hiring local agents to represent them. And this usually meant local Christians, Arabic speakers. The man they chose for Damascus, Mikhail Mishaka, is a well-known intellectual of the Nahda era, who wrote a series of tracts on religion, on music, on general knowledge. He was later to write a very influential history of the 18th and 19th century. But he was appointed as America's vice consul in Damascus with direct responsibility to the American consul in Beirut. And his appointment took effect in 1859. And when I first called up the registers, the archivists said that they couldn't find the first three registers. The earliest they had were from the 1870s. And when I pressed them, they invited me to make an appointment to go back into the stacks with an archivist and satisfy myself on what had happened to the first three volumes that seemed to be missing. And when I went back, you had all these very august leather-bound volumes of American correspondence from their different diplomatic missions. And they're kind of standard issue, great big leather-bound, made in America kind of books. And there on the side of the bookshelves were these three little notebooks, leather-bound in sort of red leather. And I took them down, and they were all entirely in Arabic. And the first one starts in 1859, and it's identified as Mikhail Mishaka's reports. I realized we'd found those first three volumes and was so excited to find that, lost in the archive were these three volumes entirely written in Arabic of weekly reports from Damascus from 1859. And it's unlike any other source we have on the events in Damascus in 1860, almost all of which were written as retrospective memoirs or histories of survivors. Mishaka's reports were taken in the weeks leading up to the event, through the events, and in the weeks and months afterwards. Mishaka was himself caught up in the violence. He was very badly injured, separated from his family. He was too badly hurt to flee Damascus, as many of the survivors did, to go to Beirut for the relative safety of the coastal city. And so his reports really document the violence and its aftermath. And it's written from a perspective of a Christian notable of Damascus, who'd been already a resident of Damascus for 3 decades by the time these events strike. And they give us the sense of events without any hindsight. You can genuinely feel the fear of the Christian community's survivors about what the future held for them, and the violence that followed this attack, and the state's reactions, the limits of justice. And I think in reading through these reports, it really gave me an idea that what was much more important for historians today is not to explain the violence and how it happened, but to look at the project of reconstruction, which stands out as an Ottoman success story, how they went about rebuilding the Christian quarters, bringing some closure through measures to bring justice to those who'd suffered death and dispossession, and then to create a kind of environment in which all communities in Damascus might equally benefit through a reinvigorated Ottoman rule. And rather like the situation in Mount Lebanon, which was characterized by the Ottoman historian Engin Akarlı as the long peace, the new governing structures put in place in Lebanon after their bloodletting, you have a real success story in the Ottoman reconstruction and reintegration of the Christians. And the big difference here is that unlike Lebanon, which would, after the violence of the summer of 1860, increasingly create a confessional or sectarian system of government, the distinctive thing about Damascus was the way in which reintegration takes place without creating a sectarian legacy. I would argue you don't really have sectarian tensions in Damascus after 1860 until the war that follows the popular uprising of 2011 was to so fragment Syria along regional and sectarian lines. So, I really am more interested in reconstruction and reintegration than in the roots of massacre in this project.
So, Eugene, you preempted my next question, which was about reconstruction, the Ottoman success story in the wake of this terrible violence. And it makes me think, to write a book about the events of 1860 in the year 2020, within the decade of a new terrible set of events in much the same region, this must put a different spin on your research and the types of conclusions that you draw, or indeed the type of audience that you're writing this book for. So could I ask you to talk a bit about the contemporary context? What are, if I could ask you now to maybe put on the hat, not purely of a historian, but also of someone who knows something of the way in which societies rebuild after terrible moments of bloodletting, what are the lessons of that episode over 150 years ago that may or may not apply in the midst of a new intercommunal confessional conflict in much the same region?
Yeah, thank you, Christian. I thought a lot about that because, I first intended to write this book back in the first years of the 21st century. And at that point, I think the emphasis would have been on quite different features of the history of 1860 and its aftermath. And I do think that as I approach this question today, I am as much influenced by current affairs as of reconstruction efforts from 150 years ago. And I think the question I have, obviously the magnitude of the destruction and the violence today bears no comparison with the experience of Damascus in 1860. 1860 was unprecedented for its time, but it was an outburst of violence that lasted, less than a week. The casualty figures were far more discreet than what we've seen since 2011 in Syria. And so I think the scope to rebuild and reintegrate was far likelier to be successful then than it is now. So I don't wish to draw a false parallel between lessons learned from 1860 and how they might apply today. But if I were to point one finger to what might be relevant in the earlier history. One, I think it's very important to be reminded of their own history and looking for how they come out of the current abyss that they have fallen into through nearly 10 years of civil conflict that has displaced half the population of Syria and laid waste to its cities in a way which, you'd have to go back to the Second World War to find equivalency. And I think here there is a need to balance the legitimate search for justice and accountability. Those who have suffered injustice and violence will want to see those responsible brought to justice, and that is legitimate and understandable. But under the current context, it seems unlikely. It seems that the current regime in Syria has, for all intents and purposes, won the conflict through assistance from its allies, Iran and Russia in particular, and that the opposition does not have the critical mass or the force to displace them. And if indeed we're looking at a Syria that is going to remain under Ba'athist government rule or under Assad family rule, what hope is there for the displaced Syrians? And here I think the hope would have to lie in forcing the regime to abandon the abuses that have led to so much bloodshed and to put in place structures that will create the possibility of a shared future, which will provide benefit to the next generation that perhaps the pursuit of justice or continued civil war makes further, more and more remote. In other words, can we see a way forward in which the international community forces the regime in Syria to rebuild cities in a way that allows Syrians to return to their homeland in safety, where jails will no longer be places in which people disappear without accountability for arbitrary abuse by a government that has lost the trust of the people, where perhaps the reconstruction project can bring investment to Syria that will allow for the kind of job creation, the rebuilding of institutions in education, in healthcare, that will provide a future for Syrians. I think this is the element of the Ottoman story that's interesting to me. It was about bringing new resources to Damascus by creating new structures of governance. The application of the 1866 provincial reform law to Syria is certainly part of the Ottoman reconstruction bid that is going to create institutions that give Syrian Christians more voice in their government, and in that more confidence in the Ottomans to provide a secure and stable future for them. And the expansion of the province of Damascus into the province of Syria, which takes on larger territories, stretching down into regions of northern Palestine, around coastal Lebanon, and creating then more tax revenues that gives the provincial governor of Damascus more money with which to try and invest in the infrastructure, the markets, the communications network, local government administration, and all of this, again, creating government structures that give Syrians or Damascenes a stake in a better future that will make them concede some of the demands for justice in the past in the interest of providing a better future for themselves and the next generation. It's somewhere in this provision of institutions that restore confidence that people will have voice, and then providing for opportunity for a better future, where I think there may be scope for rebuilding and reconciling the deeply divided, deeply traumatized people of Syria. Not an easy agenda by a long shot. And again, I don't wish to bring any false parallels into the analysis, but I think that's where reading about the history of rebuilding and reconstruction after the deep traumas of 1860 will resonate in a different way in the 2020s.
Thanks, Eugene. I want to make sure we leave time for a few questions, but if I may, I'll share with the group my own personal experiences of the events of 1860, and when I first came to know about them, as I mentioned to you the other day, Eugene, I spent a lot of time in Damascus in the immediate years leading up to the war, and I lived in Bab Tuma. I lived in the neighborhood that you just mentioned, which was the real epicenter of these attacks. And as far as the memory of these events resonating down the decades and now the centuries, I was extremely interested to discover that the Christians of Damascus, and in my personal experience, the Maronite Catholic Christians, venerate martyrs that come from this famous episode. The ones that I came to know just by observing what was going on in the streets and what was happening in the churches were three brothers known as the Massacres brothers. I believe all of them laymen, two of them were married, who, according to the hagiography, and I think that's the only way to describe it, although we're talking about events in the relatively recent past, were slaughtered inside the Franciscan convent in the middle of Babtuma. And so there is a whole cult and a whole sacred memory that surrounds the lives of these men. And I haven't done my research, but I think that probably one would find similar experiences among the different churches that you find in Damascus and in Syria at large, martyrs and saints that are revered from this famous episode. So, this is a pattern that interests me from late antiquity, the medieval period, where I've done a lot of research on similar things. So I was fascinated to see many of these same techniques of memory making, cults of martyrs as a way of reliving tragedy, and I think situating groups in the present. So I think studying the aftermath of these events will hopefully take you well beyond the Ottoman period and up until today. And I think people's minds, though in sometimes surprising ways, in Damascus now. So Eugene, maybe with your permission, I'll turn it over to the crowd. If anyone has any questions for Eugene, maybe indicate with the hand-raising function on Teams, and fire away.
And while we're waiting for the question hands to crop up, just to say, Christian, I found your discussion about the Massacres brothers utterly fascinating. I wasn't aware of that. I'll be on the lookout for what I have on the circumstances of their death. I know about the sacking of the Franciscan monastery in Damascus, and I think that even features in some of the photographs that we have from the time. But it's definitely one of the questions I have is the extent to which there is in popular memory an awareness of the events in 1860, and certainly your own work on the Massacres goes to show that indeed there is, and I'll be really interested to follow that up.
Great. I see a hand from David Taylor.
Hi, Eugene. Thank you for that. Thank you very much. You've described the events very much as an internal set of events, but from my rather hazy memory of what was happening, it also led to a major French military intervention. So one of the first interventions by Western powers into the Ottoman kind of region, using the idea of defending the Christians as their pretext for doing that. Do you have any thoughts again about, as it were, the relative success of that? I mean, from my perspective, that leads eventually to the mandate. I mean, they withdraw the troops, but that precedent has been set. So as well as thinking about how these events have consequences, as it were, for the modern state of Syria, the consequences of Western intervention in the region.
Thank you, David. Yes, it's a really great observation. The Beaufort mission to Syria, which I think was 3,000 strong, a very large campaign force, was dispatched as soon as word of violence reached France, and was something that sounded alarm bells right across the Ottoman Empire. They were only too aware at how minority rights issues, Christian minorities in particular, had served as a pretext for French, Russian, even British intervention. And I think the Ottomans were terrified that the violence in Mount Lebanon and Damascus was going to give the French justification for making a land grab in the Eastern Mediterranean, similar to, let us say, the occupation of Algeria. Their response was to take their most able diplomat, the Ottoman Foreign Minister Fuad Pasha, and put him in charge of bringing justice and closure to the situation in Damascus in particular. And Fuad very clearly did everything he could to ensure the French did not move from the coastal plain south of Beirut, where their soldiers had landed. He persuaded de Beaufort that the French troops were most needed to be ready to be deployed in the event that there were any further attacks anywhere. So they shouldn't move from where they were, they should be kept together. And this way kept them from, let us say, taking over Beirut, let alone marching on to Damascus. And after, I think it's 8 or 9 months, then Fouad was able to convince the French that they no longer needed to keep the troops there and they could withdraw in peace. And that was seen very much as the success of Fouad's mission. He was able to demonstrate both that the Ottomans were capable of maintaining peace in that very volatile moment, a moment where, following violence in Mount Lebanon and Damascus, there was also the threat of the outbreak of violence in other areas in Greater Syria, certainly Nablus, Nazareth, in the Palestinian territories had known some risk of violence against Christian communities as well. And the other interesting legacy is that, of course, Britain, France, the Ottomans sit down to try and hammer out an agreed future for Mount Lebanon. And it's at that point where the French put forward a map of a greater Lebanon, which they weren't able to realize in the project of the new governing structures of Mount Lebanon, which came to be known as the Mutasarrafiyya, a kind of hybrid Ottomanized ruling structure to replace the previous government structures that had been in place in the autonomous province of Mount Lebanon. But that map of the greater Lebanon envisaged by the French in 1860-61 is very much the one that's resurrected in 1920, when the French then act on the plan of a greater Lebanon. So you're absolutely right. The foundations for a kind of French interference in Syria and Lebanon, and particularly the shaping of a greater Lebanon, dates right back to these events.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this discussion. If I may interrupt, I would like as well to invite questions for the first paper. We didn't have time to discuss it. Now we have a few minutes. So thank you so much for these two wonderful presentations, and please ask questions concerning both of them. No more questions? Well, in this case, I think that thank you very much again. It was absolutely wonderful. Two very different but fascinating papers. One book that you can already read at our faculty. One book that you are all looking forward to read. Congratulations to both of you, and thank you very much for the participation. Thank you for our speakers, and thank you for all of you. And well, I hope that you are going to meet maybe in person rather than online next term for next research conversations. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.